Hi, everyone. Really excited to have everyone be here for our Capsule webinar series. This is a whole series of webinars that we're hosting in May, and the purpose is really to hopefully inspire folks to take some of these ideas, take some of the skills that we're going to talk about and the tools that we're learning about and bring them to the event. So I'm really excited to introduce Corey. She is the communication coordinator for the Resource Watch, which is part of the World Resources Institute. And she'll be talking about open data, talking a whole ton about how they use data on their platform and how Research Watch actually works. And what's really exciting is that we'll actually do a live demo in this session. So before we get started, I hand it off to Corey. I'll just ask that if everyone can please mute themselves. If we feel that there's background noise at any time, we will mute you. But another thing is that while Corey's presenting, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat. And that way, at the end, we'll do some quick questions and just quick Q&A. And at that point, I'll just go through in order to make sure we don't miss anybody. But go ahead and type in the chat box. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Corey.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I assume you guys can still see my screen. Sarah, you guys can see the slides, right?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Well, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Corey, and I am the communications coordinator for the Resource Watch team. I'm going to be showing you the platform today and talking a little bit about how open data is involved and pretty much runs what we do at Resource Watch, but how it can potentially help you and your projects and your work with Capsule as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to offer a little bit of background into Resource Watch. It launched April 11th of 2018 as the centerpiece of the World Resources Institute's open data platforms and tools. And so the World Resources Institute, if you're unfamiliar, is a global environmental think tank. We have offices in 8 countries right now, when we work on pretty much every corner of the environment. So oceans, forests, cities, anything you can think of that exists on the planet, we probably have a team doing research on it. And WRI a couple of years ago made a commitment to open data. And so any of our research that comes out of WRI, as well as any of our partners' research, we try to encourage them to do this as well, is open to share and download and replicate and criticize, because WRI and particularly Resource Watch believe in the value of open data for the world. This Resource Watch is designed to be kind of the capstone of this promise, but there's also another dozen or so, I'd say, open data platforms that were a part of this. You may be familiar with Global Forest Watch or Aqueduct, which measures water risk. So anything you see coming out of WRI is open source and is something that we're eager to share with you. Resource Watch in particular is a repository for pretty much the world's most available and best quality data on dozens of issues that sit at the nexus of the environment and human development. And this came out of the idea and the realization that there was really too much data and too little time. I'm sure many of you have experienced this, where you go and you have a question and you type something into Google and you get hundreds of thousands of search results back. Our mission is to change that, to make it super easy to find the information that you need and to know right away that it's trusted, that it's curated, and that it's something that you can feel comfortable using. And we don't do this alone. We do this with a really large partner network. Everyone you see here has provided funding, data, technology assistance. Resource Watch is owned and managed by WRI, but it really is the result of a large global partnership. We're trying to take data out of silos. We're trying to unlock it. We're trying to share it with the people that can do the most good with it. And these are the folks that help us do so. Of all this data that we've collected, it covers a ton of different areas. So everything you see here is something that we have data on. And we're adding new data all the time. But more importantly, what we have are data that cover the intersection of these things. So when you're looking for data on energy, we don't want you to just look for energy data. We want you to look for data sets and overlays that tell the story of how cities are getting their energy, where it comes from, who has access, how it's being used, what that has as an effect on climate change. All these things are very connected. And we try to do this by providing a really robust library. Right now, we're over 300 data sets, and over 50 of those are what we call near real time, meaning they're updating often enough that you can use them to measure what's happening on the planet as it occurs. So before we go straight into the demo, I do want to cover what the learning objectives are for today. First, we're going to talk about what open data is, and then we're going to look at, how and why you should be using open data for your projects. And finally, by the end, I hope you guys can see how Resource Watch can support you in your projects. First and foremost, in terms of what open data is, I think we can answer that right now. Open data is Resource Watch. It's exactly what you're about to see. It is data that has been made available to view, download, manipulate, use, share. It's something that is a free and global resource that we think is incredibly valuable for increasing transparency, making really smart decisions, and fueling projects like what you guys are working on now. And so I'm going to go straight into the demo of the site. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then I'll share the window with the website. And keep in mind that you can ask questions at the end, so do keep track of what you're thinking about throughout the presentation. Okay. And you guys should be seeing resourcewatch.org right now. If you'd like to follow along, you can. It's www.resourcewatch.org, or you can simply watch along with the demo and ask questions at the end. So this is our homepage. You'll find that this is a good place to get started. We have the latest stories from our Resource Watch blog in here, as well as a dashboard selection and a couple of different ways that you can interact with the data. The first thing I'm going to show you are our dashboards. And because I'm at home and my internet is not as good as the office, I've preloaded all of these pages. So you can either click here, but these are the dashboards. The dashboards are our idea of how you can dive into really complex global issues. So we have data on all of these topics, but what we've done here is provided context for how you can view them through a lens that is scientific, that is researched, and that is well-informed. So we cover food, ocean, energy, forests, cities, society, climate, and water. We're also working on a series of more niche dashboards, for example, air quality. This just got released, and there's going to be more in the coming weeks and months. These are going to be really in-depth looks at issues that fall into these categories, because air quality impacts cities and climate and society, and it falls between a lot of these areas. But it is a huge topic, and so we wanted to provide an access point for that. To show you what these look like, I'm going to use the cities page. And these are all authored by WRI staff and by our team at Resource Watch to create a really complete look at the issue. For example, with cities, this tells the story of human beings living in cities, right? So here we see the beginnings of, urban areas developing and populations growing. Resource Watch is primarily a data visualization platform, so you'll see a ton of maps and charts and graphs, things that you can explore and play around with. So it tells the story of how the world became urbanized, what that's going to look like in the future, what this means for resource management, what this means for land use, pretty much anything you want to know about cities, you can probably find data or a snippet of information here. And this is a good place to remind you that everything you find on Resource Watch is open source. So any of these maps, charts, graphs, text, whatever it is that you want to use, you can. All you have to do is hit the share button, and you'll find this all throughout the site. You can hit copy, and then there's your bit.ly. This will take you to exactly the map that you're viewing now. You can also share it on email or on social media, or if this is something that you think would be interesting to embed into your project somehow, into a website, into a blog, we have the embed code ready to go, ready to be copied. We also have the opportunity to save these data sets. So if this is something you think would be valuable for your research, all you have to do is hit the star. And you have to have an account for this to work. The accounts are completely free, and all they do is they unlock our custom features. So if you want to create your own dashboard with data relevant to your project, if you want to save data to a collection, if you want to keep track of data you're going to be coming back to, let's say we'll call this one research. And we go ahead and add, and see I have all of these different topics that I can do, and I'll add this to research, or my research right here, and it's been checked. And so you notice the star now fills in, and when I go to my account, this is going to be sitting there. So this is a really good way to get started if you're uncertain about how to approach some of these issues, or if you're interested in learning more. But if you want to jump right into the data, you can do that. This is our Planet Pulse feature. Planet Pulse is a visualization tool that we've created on Resource Watch that takes a selection of some of our favorite and we think really valuable near real-time data sets across a number of these issues and makes it really easy to see what's going on. So under land, water, air quality, climate, humanitarian issues, and hazards. I'm going to turn on the fires layer. And so all of this is happening live. These data sets are up. I think this one updates every day. I could be wrong about that. It might be every 30 minutes. But you can see how old the fires are here on the legend. And as you scroll around the planet, you'll see where there are active fires. When Brazil was experiencing forest fires, you could see the entire area right here lit up. You can constantly see agricultural burning in this area. The Australia fires were really prevalent along the coast here. This is just a really good way to visualize current events as they happen. So things like earthquakes or floods, you can see here really easily and share the images. Under air quality, I'm going to turn on PM 2.5 and use this as an opportunity to showcase what kinds of data we have on the site. So data can be a little bit different in format and methodology and appearance, and that can sometimes make it a little bit tricky to work with. For example, this data set is coming from OpenAQ, which is a really great organization that we've partnered with to bring this data out. And each one of these dots is actually a small sensor attached to a building. And when you get enough of these sensors together, you can get kind of a complete look of the air quality in a region, in a country. You know, you can click on each one of these dots and see this one is in Madison, Wisconsin, gives you the concentration of PM 2.5, which is a well-known air pollutant and affects air quality and health of the people living there. You can see when it was last updated. And generally, you can see that in the US, air quality is pretty solid. But when you go down to South America, you'll notice there's a huge gap here. That's not because the air quality is great or it's really terrible, it's because there are no sensors. So there are gaps in any kind of data. And in this case, you'll see whole swaths of the planet that unfortunately don't have the sensors set up, that aren't networked, that aren't part of this data set, that we just don't have access to. So while this is the best available data for global air quality, you can see there are still huge gaps. It's still a really valuable tool, though. You can really easily at a glance compare something like the United States' air quality to China or India and figure out why it is that the air quality there is different. If it's regulation, if it's industry, it's a nice snapshot. There are also different types of data. This data is point data, so it's individual points that add up to a whole. This is a raster data set on coral reef bleaching, and this is coming from NOAA. Every data set on Resource Watch is coming from a really trusted source that has its own methodology that's been additionally reviewed by our data team to make sure it's of the utmost quality. And when you overlay that with the reef locations layer, you can see at a glance where reefs are currently in trouble. And so this is giving you for the last 7 days where reef bleaching is occurring. So if you're working on a project related to climate, to ocean health, this is a really powerful visual that you can utilize to kind of hit home the impact of events like coral bleaching on a region. But this is just a visualization tool. This is just a small subset of the data that we have on Resource Watch. If you want to dive into the full catalog, you can do so under the Data tab. You can either hit Explore or hit Data directly. And I brought myself over here. This is where you'll find all 302 of the data sets currently on Resource Watch. It's a lot. But we make it pretty easy to find what you're looking for when you can sort by topic, the different types of data, the frequency that the data is updated, and time period. So if you're looking for something that's projected or if you're looking for something that's historical. So I always like to start out with a single data set because I think oftentimes a single data set can be incredibly insightful. Here I've sorted by topic, so anything to do with biodiversity that's been tagged is going to pop up. And I'm going to add a layer on biodiversity intactness. So this shows you the percentage of biodiversity in that area that is still intact. And if we scroll in, you'll see in the red, you can click, and the percentage here is 71% intact biodiversity. Whereas in the darker green, you'll notice it's over 100, which is interesting. But this is a really good way to take a look at an issue if you're looking at animals, if you're looking at tree cover, if you're looking at ecosystems. This is a good way to get started. And you'll also notice this data is from 2005. So not every data set is going to be updated every 30 minutes. Sometimes data, particularly on things like biodiversity or agriculture, They're incredibly difficult to collect, and oftentimes information is proprietary. And so 2005 in this case is the best available data. It's a complex thing to work with, but it's still incredibly valuable. One of the best things about Resource Watch is the fact that you can overlay data to find pretty interesting connections. So you can add as many layers to the map as you want. I would advise sticking to maybe 2 to 4, and then you can look at the resolution, you can look at the dates of coverage, you can look at where they overlap and find things that are interesting, but you can add as many as you want. For this example, I'm going to look at nitrogen dioxide. You just search in here for what you're looking for, and everything should pop up here in the side panel. This is what I'm looking for. This is a data set that's coming from the Tropomi satellite, and it is a monthly aggregation of nitrogen dioxide plumes. So anywhere you see that bright yellow or that bright orange, that's a plume of nitrogen dioxide that you can see from the satellite. And when you zoom in to India, for example, you'll see there are some pretty distinct dots of nitrogen dioxide, which is an air pollutant, and you have to wonder what those are coming from, what's causing it. In this case, I'm going to add the Global Power Plant database. This is a WRI data set that we're incredibly proud of. It is the most up-to-date and complete data set available openly on power plants, and you can sort by capacity and by type. If you see this little icon here, it means there are multiple layers to the data set that you can add. In this case, I'm going to look at just coal power plants, and we can zoom in and see that these dots overlay really nicely. So this visualization gives you a good place to start. You can then ask a series of questions about, is this causing it? What does that mean? What does that mean for the health of the people who live here? What does that mean in terms of regulation? There's a ton of things that can, jump off of these visualizations. And then at the end, you can come back and you can really easily embed the map. So again, anytime you see the arrow, you can just hit the button, copy the link to share, or copy the link to embed. And each one of these data sets has potentially dozens of stories and connections that you can make within it. For example, with this same NO2 data, if you scoot on over here to the Red Sea, you'll see this really distinct line here. And that's really consistent. We've seen that month over month since we added this data set. And one of our data scientists on our data team who was playing around on the site noticed this connection. And this is how easy it is to find overlapping things. If you search for shipping, and add the commercial shipping lanes layer, you can turn this on and off and see that it overlaps perfectly. And so what you're seeing here is because of the small space and the dense shipping traffic, there is a really distinct and consistent line of nitrogen dioxide. And you can see, even when you change the opacity down, that this is a connection between an industry and an air pollutant. So I'll quit this example and show you one more. We're going to zoom out. You can also search by location if you don't feel like zooming in particular, but we're not going too far in depth today, so I'll just do this. And I'm going to clear the filters out and change the base map. So we pride ourselves on visualization. In order to make that really easy, we've got a bunch of different base layers that you can use to put your data sets on top of or to share. You can turn on your labels, you can turn on boundaries. Really easy to work. In this case, this is a really interesting story that we found with our forest team. If you add in tree cover loss here, you'll see a number of data sets pop up related to tree cover loss, deforestation, forests. In this case, the data set is coming from the University of Maryland. It's something that we share with Global Forest Watch, which is a dedicated platform from WRI, which is also open and available for you guys to use. It's a really great tool, and they work on tree cover loss. This data set goes all the way back to 2001, and the latest numbers from 2018 show a big difference. That's partly because the data has improved, and partly because there's been a lot of deforestation since 2001. You'll see here, there are some really interesting spots in the tree cover loss data that seem like they're missing. Looks like somebody took a cookie cutter to it. And you have to wonder why that is. If you search for data on Indigenous rights, once this loads, you'll be able to see the overlap here really clearly. And the power that this has to tell stories, to make things really clear. Sometimes this is stuff that people already know, but they need to see in data to feel confident in it. Sometimes this is enough to change people's minds entirely. The visualization here is an incredibly powerful tool. And you can turn these layers on and off and see, particularly around here and here, this kind of fits in directly like a stamp. And so what you're seeing is the power of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' rights to their land in keeping tree cover intact, to protecting forests, and to stopping deforestation. And so that's really exciting to see. And it's done with satellites, which I think is always super interesting. And it's easy to add these things to the map and see the connections within the Resource Watch site. But if you want to dig a little bit deeper, if you want to learn more, we make that really easy as well. Every single data set on Resource Watch comes with its own dedicated metadata page. You can access that either by hitting Details or by hitting the I button anywhere on the site. In this case, I'll hit the I button and then More Info. And this brings you to the dedicated metadata page for, in this case, the Global Power Plant database. So this tells you everything you need to know about the data set in question. You know, the source, the title, any of these pages you can also share and save. And it took me back. We're going to go back to the metadata page. Just hit I again. And so you also have an overview of the data set, the methodology for how the data was collected, which is really critical, and a key to seeing. Apologies, I keep hitting open in map when I come to the page because I'm on a laptop. One moment. Moving off of that. Okay, so this is a lot of really valuable information. You can also hit open in map, just like I've been doing, which will take you back to the Explore map where you can visualize it and you can overlay it with a bunch of other data sets. You can also hit download from source or learn more. And these two will take you to the original data source. So you can learn about it in the paper that it came from. You can download the original, sheet. You can download the original shape file or the Excel document. And that's, how you can get access to the raw data. We also have a bunch of other information down at the bottom, which is incredibly crucial. The caution section, I think, is particularly valuable when you're working with open data. As you saw with the air quality information, there are huge gaps. There are huge caveats. That's just the nature of working with data. We have a data set on projected sea level rise, for example, which is incredibly powerful, and it shows you where places might be underwater under different scenarios. But what it doesn't take into account is the construction of dams or levees. And so it is still a really useful tool for an analysis, for a visualization, but it does have that caveat, and knowing that is going to make your project and your research stronger. And we've done a lot to pull those cautions out and make them really easy to identify. We also have suggested citations, the sources again, and then as you get into analysis work, this information is incredibly important down at the bottom. What the geographic coverage is, what the date of content is, and what the frequency of updates are. So if you have a recent event like a landslide and your data set is from 2004, maybe there's a little bit of a gap there and you can find better data. That's what we're here for. We're happy to help navigate the data on the site or help you if you have a data set that you think will be valuable for your project. If it meets our standards, we can try and add it to the site so that you can do those overlays and can do those visualizations. What I'm going to show you now is our blog. I just went from the metadata page to the blog. You can select up top. And the reason I like to show this very briefly is because this can all be incredibly overwhelming. 300 data sets, endless combinations, and a ton of terminology that is data analysis and research specific. It can be kind of intense at a first glance. And so we've done a lot to try and make this information digestible. And we do that primarily through our blog. So we do a lot of storytelling, a lot of visualization. This example right here, the runways underwater, uses that sea level rise data set that I mentioned to show where airports could potentially be underwater if action isn't taken on climate change. So this is a really good resource for you as well. And then if you want to get involved, learn more, you can go ahead and hit the About page. And this will take you to right here. So under Get Involved, under Get Involved, there's a couple different things you can do. Of course, we want you to stay in touch with us. Like I said, if you want to contribute data to the site, if you have data that's global, that's exciting, that's peer-reviewed that you think would be valuable to add, if there's something that would be valuable for your project, or just in general, if you notice a gap in our catalog, let us know. Same with suggesting a story. If you have a connection that you've established on the site, or you find something that's really interesting, you can let us know and we can try and share that. Under Join the Community, there are a couple of different ways that you can stay in touch with us, and I'll put these up at the end of the presentation as well. But we always want you to email us, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our newsletter, stay in touch, because as I said earlier, we're constantly updating the catalog, constantly updating with blogs, and you don't want to miss out on anything. Just give me 1 second to go back into the presentation. And then we'll move towards questions just as we start wrapping up. Okay. So back to our learning objectives, just to quickly wrap up. Discovering what open data is. We've talked a lot about what open data is, what it looks like, what it can do, and why you should be using it for your project. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but using open data means that other people can look at what you've done and replicate it. They can share it, they can have it be a part of their research. It builds upon itself, and so you have a common good resource that is driving change. We're huge advocates for open data here at Resource Watch, and we think that everyone else should be too. And Resource Watch, I think, is an incredibly powerful tool. I think it can support the projects that Capsule is helping support, that Capsule is working on. We've got a ton of raw information and a lot of things that can be done with it. And since you guys are taking that and putting that on the ground, I think this is a match made in heaven. I'm just going to head it off. One of the main questions I always get is how to cite data accessed through Resource Watch. And what you do is you cite the original data source followed by access through Resource Watch. You'll find that suggested citation at the bottom of each metadata page. That way you get to cite the original data authors as well as Resource Watch. It is an open source tool. We are a nonprofit, so as much attention as we can get on the site, the more eyes we can get, the more useful it is to the world. And just to wrap up, the Resource Watch team is available to assist in this process. I am on the communications team, but we have a platform team that develops the site, does user testing, tries to make this valuable. We have a data team that's constantly updating and adding data to make it a really robust catalog. You can feel free to reach out at any of these methods. You can email resourcewatch@wri.org if you have suggestions or questions that we don't get to today, but we're here to assist, and I hope that this website is particularly useful for you guys. I think we can move to Q&A now, if that's all right with Sarah.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you so much. I will fully admit I'll be doing a deep dive into the platform myself, just discovering patterns. I'm sure everyone hopefully is feeling the same way. So right now we'll go into the Q&A, and we'll just go line by line as tackling questions as they came through. And some of this might be a little bit repetitive. We'll just see what folks are asking. So
Sure.
the question is, how do you select the right data set? You mentioned you have 300 plus data sets, but how does someone really choose what aligns with their project?
Okay, for what aligns with their project, that's entirely something they have to investigate on their own. But what you can do is you can look at the metadata page, you can look at the information in the methodology and decide if that's going to help answer the question that you ask. So if you're asking, I'll give you an example. We recently did a sub-granting program with journalists in Indonesia, and they wanted to know what the impacts of sea level rise would be on Java. And so what they were doing was they were looking at our projected sea level rise data when they were looking for a historic data set that was going to tell them how much seas had risen over the last 10 years. And so there are a couple of gaps like that where you can say right off, I think this might be useful, this might not be. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to download the original data set and do a little bit of investigation. The more specific you can be with your question, the more useful we can be. I think if you ask, what is water access? What are all the water bodies in all of South Africa? That's a really broad question. But if you have a specific, lake in mind or a river body in mind, and you say, I want to know what potential, water risk there is for this water body, we can potentially look at that question. And that's something you can bring to your own research. The more specific you are, the more the data can help.
I love that question and your answer. So the next question is, how do you build a strong data set?
How do you build a strong data set? That is a good question. That is not what we do on Resource Watch, but it is an incredibly valuable skill. We are collecting other people's data, not creating our own. But what we've noticed in our collection is the strong methodology. You want to be very clear and rigorous and reviewed in how you're collecting your information. Because with open data, you want it to be something that is replicable, that is accessible, that is understandable. So anything you do to meet those standards would be a good first step, but not our forte.
So the next question is related to that. So if you're collecting all of these data sets and you obviously have them on Research Watch, researchers sometimes are not the best about publicizing their work. So how are you able to really be dedicated in sourcing these great data sets?
We have an incredible data team on Resource Watch. Small but mighty is the terminology I use. And so there was a huge push when Resource Watch was launched to do a large inventory of what issues the world was facing and what data sets would be relevant to those. And as we've grown, we've started to notice gaps, or we've had users come to us and say, I have a question on this, what data is available? And that's pushed us to really think about what's missing. So it's an ever evolving process, but the data team does a really good job of taking inventory of what we have, what we don't, looking through, research groups and scientific magazines to try and find the latest and greatest in environmental data. But that's why it's called a living library. We're constantly updating and finding better information. When we do, sometimes we'll archive previous data sets and add new ones. Again, that's why I always say follow us on our newsletter and on social media, because when we do add new data, we want to make sure that everyone's aware of it.
So the next question is that, can anyone then contribute a data set?
Right now, we are exclusively focused on global data sets and global data sets that have been peer reviewed and that have gone through a really rigorous process. And then we do our own review. So I believe, our data guidelines. Let me see if I have these up. I do. Give me 1 second and I'll share this screen. We have a process for how we look at data. First of all, it has to come from a really good source with a clear methodology. It also has to be open. So these are the guiding principles that we're using. It has to be relevant, it has to be reliable, it has to be timely. If you know of data that fits these criteria that will be valuable for your project or valuable for anyone else who's working with open data, please do share it with us, and we'll put it through our process and we can add it to the site.
And then the next question is, how is Research Watch?
I missed the second half of that question, I apologize.
Oh, how is Research Watch funded?
Funded, it's primarily, actually, I think we have Emily Nielsen on the phone, who is part of our team as well. So Emily, you can feel free to answer any of these as well.
Hi, yeah, I'm just listening in, but I'm happy to jump in if you want.
Yeah, so we're funded primarily through right now a group called DOB Ecology out in the Netherlands. Sorry, Emily, are you gonna? I see like little dots. I don't know if you're trying to talk.
Oh no, I wasn't doing anything, but yeah. So we get our funding predominantly from foundations, from bilateral agreements with European governments, mostly coming from WRI funds generally. But most of our funds to date have been through foundations, and some of those coming in through joint collaborative initiatives that we're doing with other programs at WRI.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so the next question is, love the blog and love that as the first entry step to getting to know Research Watch. What were the steps that you would say for someone new who's coming in to take so that they're not so overwhelmed by the complete resource? Like, what would be the first 3 things that folks do to get started?
So my process, because I am not a data native, it's very foreign to me. That's why I work in communications. My process is that I come in with a question or a topic that I think is something I would love to know the answer to. And then I scroll through that tag, or I scroll through whatever pops up when I search for that and see what pops up that's relevant. And if you find something you think is interesting, the next step we always tell people is to think about what affects that and what it is affected by. So when we were looking at, for example, for a presentation, data on crisis management and emergency management and weather and hurricanes, we don't have real-time hurricane data, but what we do have is data on roads, airports, infrastructure, things like that that could be impacted. Access to cities, how far people would have to go to evacuate, what access to internet looks like, you know, in terms of early warning systems or keeping people aware of what happens after a disaster strike. So thinking about the chain of events for how things are managed and who has access helps open up a lot of doorways in terms of finding data that's relevant or connectable.
So you'd also mentioned in the previous question or answer that you have 4 key criteria for assessing data sets that are your way. How would someone contribute? Would it be just emailing you or tweeting at you for a data set that they think is useful?
So we have an option on the site to suggest data to add to the website. You can also feel free to share it on Twitter or via email. But yeah, no, there is an option on the site to suggest data where I would recommend people go, especially, and the more information you can share about that data, the better. So if you have a link, if you have why you think it's valuable, where you heard about it, what you might use it for, in the open data business, as much information as you're willing to share it, as much as you can give, that's what we're looking for.
So the next question is basically around all these different intersections that the platform offers, including looking at the indigenous groups that you mentioned, but also Aranza's curious about looking at other archaeological or heritage or historical sites, like Machu Picchu, for example. Is there a need for partners or expansion in those areas as well?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, the website and the library is living. I think we go where the demand is, where the need is. And we've seen stories like that come out before about, you know, UNESCO World Heritage sites and what, you know, potential climate impacts would have on those. We think those would be really cool for blogs. And if there is data out there that we can showcase that would bring attention to that, that would be fantastic. If there's groups out there that are working to have and collect and share data on that, we're always willing to partner. We have around 40 partners in our network right now. I think we're adding more this week. And so if somebody has something they want to contribute or work together on, if there's a project that we can start jointly, we're always open to that. And you should absolutely feel free to reach out.
And I think one of our partners actually does. So we'll make that intro.
Please do.
Okay, so the next question, we have 2 more left.
Sure.
If anyone else has them, please, this is the time to put them in the chat. So from Peter, we have, what data do you still need? Or what data is currently unavailable that perhaps you would like to see?
Good question. I think 2 come to mind for me. Waste data is something that we are working on. We've noticed a gap in that for a long time. We just added data on plastic waste, which is really exciting. But where people's waste and trash and plastic, where that all circulates and goes is something I think we've seen a gap in. And on the other side, we have data on biodiversity that is absolutely notorious to get open. So some topics people are not as willing to share information. A lot of it's proprietary. And when you're working with endangered species, it does make a lot of sense to try and keep things a little bit close to the vest. So our data team has noticed a trend where biodiversity data is pretty locked up. So if that was something we could get more access to, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so the last question is from Julian. And what do you do if you get conflicting data reports? So for example, how would you weigh in the data that you're receiving from a government agency versus an NGO nonprofit organization?
That's a really good question. I think part of that comes down to our data team and how they process the information and decide what goes onto the site. There are always going to be conflicts of information because of how the data was collected. Maybe the methodology is different. Maybe the reason the data was collected is different. We tend to go with global satellite data. That's because in our mind, that is the geospatial reliable data that we're collecting. But there are, you know, oftentimes a lot of disparities. We see that in areas where there are disputed boundaries. No mapping platform has been able to, as of today, figure out the solution to disputed boundaries between countries, because that'll change the way the data shows up. But when they do have issues, when there are disparities, that's something we want to address in our catalog. But we don't decide what the official numbers are. We just decide, you know, what the best information is that we can present.
Okay, so I think that concludes the webinar. If there's no more questions, thank you everyone that shared a question, and thank you, Corey, so much for your amazing presentation. Enrolled Resources Institute and Resource Watch supporting Capsule Hack. We really hope that you found today's session inspiring and insightful. And a quick reminder that Capsule takes place on June 20th and 21st. So to keep up with all of this amazing programming, please go to the Capsule website and check out our social media channels as well. But thank you so much, Corey, and happy Friday, wherever you are in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.